So today we're going to transition. From mostly anatomy to mostly physiology, focusing on the respiratory system, of course, and introducing some concepts and equations that are going to be important for the problem set. So the problem set I handed out, it's due on Monday at 11:30 p.m. At the CST desk, like always. And problem sets, so this is a problem set, not a quiz. And it's open book and open notes and open people. You can work together. And the goal is to get you to work through some respiratory physiology problems using equations and concepts that I'll introduce today and on Thursday. So at the end of the day today, you should be able to do some, but not all of the problems in the problem set. And it's due on Monday at 11:30 p.m. So the idea is that we're going to, so an overview or a preview of what we're going to be talking about. We'll be talking about ventilation. So I'll introduce that concept in a minute and some equations related to ventilation. And then we'll be introducing the concept of partial pressure of gases, which is easy when you're talking about a gas, but is not so easy when you're talking about blood, but it's the same concept. And then we'll be talking about some acid-base physiology that will be building on some of the acid-base things that you learned about in chemistry, or maybe just recently you learned about in biochemistry. So that's where we're going today. The first thing I wanted to do is remind you, I think I touched on this at the end of the class on Thursday, the idea of dead space. And the idea is that dead space is the physiological term for volume in the lungs that is not functional with regard to gas exchange. So all of the conducting airway is dead space. And none of the respiratory airway is really dead space, at least not physiologically. Sometimes in pathological situations, respiratory airway does become dead space, but that wasn't, and so in the quiz, some of you got the concept of, you put, for example, for respiratory bronchioles, you called that dead space, and that's not correct, because that's respiratory airway, not conducting airway. It was worth 1 point, wasn't a big deal. But the point is that the air that moves in and out of your lungs is moving, some of that air is in conducting airway and is not functional with regard to gas exchange. So this is supposed to be a space where gas exchange happens. This 350 mils of fresh air, right? This is the fresh air. This is the, already used air in the lungs. This 300, you may have breathed in 500 mils of air, but only 350 mils of it was in contact with blood, where gas exchange could happen, and 150 mils of it or so was stuck in the conducting airway and didn't exchange with the blood, didn't do gas exchange. So you'll be working with this concept of ventilation. Well, this is getting at ventilation. So I'll introduce that in just a minute, but it's also introducing the idea that some of the airway is not functional with regard to alveolar ventilation, gas exchange. Okay, so ventilation. So this room is being ventilated, right? There's air being pumped in through some intake, and then some air is being drawn off through some exhaust port. The air in this room is being refreshed through a ventilation system. Well, it's the same word that we use in respiratory physiology. Your lungs are being ventilated when you inhale. So ventilating your lungs by inhaling and exhaling is air exchange in your lungs, and so we call it ventilation. And the most important part of ventilation is alveolar ventilation, the refreshing of gases in your alveoli where gas exchange happens. So there's some equations that define ventilation. We can talk about total ventilation, which is often in the pulmonary physiology text called minute, not minute, minute ventilation. And it's just the volume of a breath which under normal circumstances is a tidal volume, right? Using the anatomical phrase for volumes. Tidal volume, which is 5, and the numbers here are not to be memorized because they're just typical. They're not accurate in any individual setting. They're just a typical setting value. So on a typical tidal volume is 500 milliliters. So 500 milliliters per breath, and a typical breathing frequency, which is sometimes called a respiratory rate, but it's not really a rate, it's a frequency, is 12 breaths per minute, but 13 and 14 and 15 is normal, and 11 and 10 is normal. So there's a range of normal, and you'll be using some normal values in your problem set that are not these values, but they'll be normal. Well, some of them will be not normal. But a typical minute ventilation, total ventilation, is 6,000 milliliters per minute. Right? Just 500 times 12. 500 mils per breath times 12 breaths per minute comes out to 6,000 milliliters per minute. That's why it's the minute ventilation. Alveolar ventilation, which is more important but not always provided, so sometimes you have to calculate it. Alveolar ventilation is the tidal volume minus the dead space volume. So this is the abbreviation that almost all pulmonary physiologists use, VDS, volume of the dead space. And I could abbreviate this TV, because that's typical. So TV minus VDS, or the tidal volume minus the dead space volume, is the gas exchange volume, right? Going back to the previous slide, this is a tidal volume. This is the dead space volume. So this is the volume that is in contact with alveoli or a respiratory airway. And so subtracting the dead space from the tidal volume gives you a volume that is alveolar. And multiplying that by the frequency gives you the alveolar ventilation. The units of ventilation should be in mils per minute. So those are pretty straightforward, and now you can answer some of the questions on the problem set. Okay, so now let's review just for a minute the circulatory system. Remember that the right ventricle pumps blood out through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries. This is simplified. Into pulmonary capillaries where gas exchange happens, right? So now you know that there are microscopic structures called alveoli that are ventilated, and I'm reminding you that there are microscopic structures called pulmonary capillaries that surround those alveoli with a very thin barrier between them in order for gas exchange to happen via diffusion. Just a reminder. And now let's start to talk about partial pressure. And so I'm going to go through the numbers. The numbers are not I don't want you to spend time memorizing numbers. I want you to focus on the concepts. So let me walk through this table. So you may know that barometric pressure at sea level, so we're not exactly at sea level here, but let's just pretend we are. Barometric pressure at sea level typically is 760 millimeters of mercury. 760 torr, I think is what the chemists call it. Physiologists still use millimeters of mercury. So 760 is the total pressure, not total partial pressure, no, total pressure of air at sea level. Some of it is nitrogen, about, I don't know what percentage that is, 80% or something 78% of the air is nitrogen. So of that 760 millimeters of mercury, 600 millimeters of mercury of it is nitrogen. So the partial pressure of nitrogen in air, in dry air, so not here because we have relative humidity that is not zero, but if we were in the middle of the Gobi Desert where the relative humidity was very low and we were at sea level, this is the situation we would have. Okay, so this is dry air. I don't think any of us have ever experienced fully dry air, because even in the desert there's a little bit of water. Anyway, this is the partial pressure of nitrogen in dry air. This is the partial pressure of water in dry air. Not typical, because there's always some water vapor in air, but this is dry air. This is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in dry air, and this is actually an old number, because the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is now higher than it was when this table was made 10 years ago, and so this is closer to 0.4. The partial carbon dioxide is increasing, and you all know about carbon dioxide emission, the greenhouse effect. Well, this is now a lowish estimate of the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. The fact is it's low. It's still low. We are going to estimate it. It's going to be rounded off to 0. For physiological purposes, this is 0, but it's increasing, right? So from an environmental perspective, this is the number that we're concerned about with global, carbon emissions. And the partial pressure of oxygen in dry air is, about 20-something percent, 20.5%. So, it's 20% is the percentage. 160 millimeters of mercury is the partial pressure of oxygen in dry Earth air. Okay, so I'm introducing something that's simple. When you breathe that air in, it's no longer dry. So we're talking about the air now that has been humidified by what? What has humidified the air in the bronchial tree, somewhere in the bronchus, in conducting airway? Mucus. Evaporation of water from mucus has hydrated the air to saturation. This is the relative humidity of the air in your airway is 100%. It is. That doesn't mean it's 100% water, of course. It means that it is carrying as much water vapor as it possibly can. The relative humidity is 100%. It is fully saturated with water. So it's moist. It's as moist as it can be. And all of the air that we breathe, whether you breathe in through your nose or breathe in through your mouth, by the time it gets to your alveoli, it is fully hydrated by the mucus. So the total pressure, we're still at sea level. So it's 760 millimeters of mercury. But because there's water in the air now, and 47 millimeters of mercury is the partial pressure of water at sea level. So 47 millimeters of mercury is the partial pressure of water vapor in fully hydrated air, fully humidified air. So now it has to add up to 760, so that 47 millimeters of mercury of water is now going to displace the other gases. So instead of having 600 millimeters of nitrogen, we now have 565 millimeters of mercury of nitrogen. Partial pressure of nitrogen is lower because some of the partial pressure of the total gas is occupied by water. You'd say, well, carbon dioxide should also be lower, but this is a rounding error. So it's still 0, basically. So the partial pressure of oxygen in humidified air, humidified lung air, is 150 millimeters of mercury, not 160, because water vapor has taken up some of the partial pressure. Okay, is that? Once we get to the understanding that there's water that sort of displaces the other gases, we're good, or at least we're getting better. Okay, so this alveolar gas now is what's in the contents of gas in an alveolus at sea level in a normal human being after the gas has equilibrated with blood. So the blood has, there's no nitrogen exchange. Nitrogen, we have nitrogen in our blood. Our blood partial pressure of nitrogen is the same as the partial pressure of nitrogen in the air that we breathe. So this is just fully equilibrated. You may know that if you get the bends, how many, are any of you scuba divers? Are you certified? So that you spend a lot of time learning about being careful to not decompress too fast. Because if you're deep in the water, your body is under compression. You're no longer at 760 torr, you're compressed. And when you decompress, gases can come out of solution in blood, and what comes out of solution first is nitrogen as bubbles. And so the bends are bubbles of nitrogen coming out of the blood due to rapid decompression. You don't have to know this. The point is there's nitrogen in the blood. That's the point. And so the nitrogen is exchanged, right? So the alveolar gas and the air nitrogen is the same because it's fully equilibrated. The air, same story here with water vapor. The air in alveolar gas is fully humidified. So it's got to be 47 millimeters of mercury. The carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in alveolar gas. So now I'm going to try to be careful. We don't call this air anymore because it's not air. It's now alveolar gas. If you call it alveolar air, I'll know what you're talking about, but you're not being specific. You're not being exactly correct. It's alveolar gas, and it's now 40 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide. Where did that carbon dioxide come from? It came from the blood. It came from the body. It came from the blood. The blood has introduced carbon dioxide into the alveolar gas. And the partial pressure of oxygen in alveolar gas is no longer what it was before it entered the alveoli. It's now lower than that. Why? Because it went into the blood. Okay? And if you add up all these numbers, they still at least approximately add up to 760 because we're still at sea level. And if I open my airway, what's in my lungs is still at 760 torr. If it weren't at 760 torr total pressure, I would be exhaling. And if it was less than 760 torr, I'd be inhaling. And we're not doing that now. We're talking about stationary air after it has exchanged with blood. Okay, the next slide will help clarify. If it's confusing, the next slide will help clarify that. Okay, so now, after the gas in the alveoli has exchanged its gases with blood, we now enter the blood enters the pulmonary veins and goes back to the left atrium and the left ventricle, and the left ventricle pumps it out the aortic semilunar valve into the systemic arterial circulation. So the contents, the pressure of the blood here is not the same as the pressure of the blood here, obviously, because this is low pressure blood returning to the left side of the heart. But the gas composition of the blood here as it exits the lungs is the same as the gas composition of the blood in the arterial circulation. And so we can call that arterial blood. It's the systemic part of it is understood. Systemic arterial blood. Okay, so now it gets confusing because we're talking about partial pressure of gas, but we're no longer talking about a gas, we're talking about a liquid. We're talking about blood plasma. We're not really even talking about red blood cells. We're talking about blood plasma. So the fact is that gases dissolve into liquids. If I were to take a beaker of water and put it in here, it would get the partial pressure of liquids. Partial pressure of gas that is in the air. Now it's weird to talk about the partial pressure of water in water, but it's still there. And because this is, the partial pressure of water in water is fully saturated, and this is the partial pressure of water in a fully saturated situation. So that number, it's weird, but it makes, on a certain level it's super weird, but on another level it makes sense. Water is 100% saturated with water vapor, and so it has a partial pressure of water of 47 millimeters of mercury. The nitrogen, why is the partial pressure of nitrogen slightly higher in blood than in alveolar gas? I actually don't even know the answer to that question, so let's just assume these numbers are the same, okay? But the point is, the nitrogen in air has a partial pressure. We've been using that all along. That shouldn't be mysterious. And so there is partial pressure of water that has been equilibrated with air. Well, in this case, this is blood that has equilibrated with alveolar gas, but it has partial pressure of nitrogen. And this partial pressure of nitrogen is what gives you the bends if you go deep into the ocean and then decompress too fast. There's partial pressure of water in the blood. There's partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood. And there's partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, because these gases exchanged almost to equilibrium during the blood passage around the alveoli, which were being ventilated. So we're going to talk two important words. We're going to talk about ventilation of alveoli, and we're going to talk about blood perfusion. The alveoli are ventilated, and the capillary blood perfuses those alveoli. And during that perfusion and during that ventilation, gas exchange happens. So although I can't explain this difference, and since nitrogen isn't important, I'm not worried about it, I can explain. So see if you can explain, why are these two numbers the same, and why are these two numbers not exactly the same? Can anyone venture a hypothesis? I haven't taught you this. And maybe you learned about this in chemistry, but maybe not. Well, let's talk about first. Why are these two numbers the same? Why is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in alveolar gas the same as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in arterial blood leaving the alveoli, leaving the lungs? They have equilibrated completely. So during this process of blood perfusing alveoli and then leaving, there is complete equilibration of carbon dioxide. Whatever is in the alveolar gas, whatever partial pressure of carbon dioxide is in the alveolar gas is going to be in the blood leaving the lungs, in the pulmonary veins returning to the heart, because of complete equilibration of carbon dioxide. Okay, so now what does this suggest about the equilibration of oxygen? Not complete. It's not it just turns out that the diffusion of oxygen is just a little bit slower than the diffusion of carbon dioxide. It's got to do with the chemistry of O2 versus the chemistry of CO2. And so the equilibration of oxygen is not perfectly complete. But in almost all circumstances, certainly in physiological circumstances, the equilibration of carbon dioxide is complete. We have to get into pathology before we would see any deviation between these two numbers. So the concept here is that alveolar CO2, the alveolar partial pressure of CO2, is equal to the arterial partial pressure of CO2. And the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen is close to, but not equal to, the arterial partial pressure of oxygen. Okay? Say that again. The partial pressure of the alveolar partial pressure of CO2 is equal to the arterial partial pressure of CO2 because of perfect equilibration of CO2. The alveolar partial pressure of oxygen is slightly higher than the arterial partial pressure of oxygen because of not quite perfect equilibration. Me.
So will that mean that there will always be a like residue amount of O2 lingering in the alveoli?
There's always a residual amount of oxygen in the alveoli, and in fact there's always a residual amount of carbon dioxide in the blood. Yes, both of those are true. So let's go. Here's a figure that I printed out large so that you could see it on your handout, and it's from your textbook. So let's walk through this simple diagram. So so this is supposed to cartoon an alveolus, and this is supposed to cartoon, let's just say, a bronchus. They're calling it air. This is a funny diagram. If it were me drawing this picture, I would call this bronchial air or bronchial gas, and I would call PO2. What would I put in this note here instead of 160? I would put 150. Okay? And what do we call the process by which this air becomes this alveolar gas? There's a word for it. Begins with a V. Ventilation. This is ventilation. The movement of air into alveoli is ventilation of alveoli. What do we call, there's a word for this of bringing blood from the right ventricle to the lung capillaries and then bringing that blood back to the left ventricle to pump into the systemic arteries. What do we call this, what's going on right here? Perfusion. This is perfusion. What's the name of the process that gives rise to this white arrow and this black arrow? Diffusion. Diffusion is not the same as perfusion. Okay, so I will hold you to that level of being specific about language. Perfusion is the movement of blood around the alveoli, and diffusion is the movement of molecules, gas molecules, from blood to gas or from gas to blood. You know what diffusion is. I'm just trying to I want to be specific about the use of words. If you say oxygen perfuses from the blood into the alveolar gas, which is really the opposite of what happens, and it's not perfusion, I would take off points for that. That's diffusion. Okay, so now, ventilation, so the air is being ventilated, and it is undergoing diffusion due to perfusion of the blood. So let's just talk, this is a cycle. This is blood going in a cycle, so I can start anywhere, and as long as I explain the full loop, I'm okay. So let's just start with cellular metabolism. I can start anywhere, so let's start with cellular metabolism. The cells produce carbon dioxide, and they consume oxygen. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor in the mitochondria, and that oxygen is converted when it accepts electrons into water. Did you know that you're making water as you're sitting here breathing? Right? You're making water. In fact, there are some desert animals that don't drink water at all. They never drink water. They get all the water they need from metabolism. They make all the water they need. And they excrete such little water. We'll talk about this when we get to the kidneys. They excrete so little water that they don't need to drink any water. They never drink water. Now, I'm being a little extreme because they do, in fact, eat food, and the food has some water in it, right? Even dried out seeds that they eat from the cactus plants or whatever it is they eat has a little bit of water in it, right? But most of the water that they live on comes from their metabolism. Okay, no, enough said. So the cells consume oxygen and produce CO2. And after the cells, so what do we call this process, this black arrow and this white arrow? Diffusion. And this is gas diffusing from the cells into the blood. And after the blood leaves the systemic circulation, not leaves leaves capillaries in the systemic circulation. Hopefully it's never leaving the systemic circulation because that means you're bleeding. The blood leaves the capillaries. It has these gas values. It has a relatively low concentration of oxygen because the oxygen that it picked up in the lungs has been consumed, absorbed by the cells. And it has a relatively high concentration, not concentration, partial pressure. I want to be careful because this is not a concentration term. This is a partial pressure term. It has a relatively high partial pressure of CO2 because the CO2 that was produced by metabolism has diffused into it. So oxygen has been consumed and turned into water, and CO2 has been produced and has been introduced into the blood. So this is the composition of venous blood. When you donate blood from, if you give blood, they draw blood from a vein. They don't draw blood from an artery. And this is the composition of blood that they draw. I mean, and it's got red blood cells and all the other stuff that blood has. But this is the gas composition of blood in the veins, in the systemic veins. Okay? Do I want you to memorize? Well, let's talk about the numbers that you do need to know at the end of this story. So now the blood is circulated. It returns this is systemic vein, so this is the vena cava, superior or inferior, returning to the right atrium and to the right ventricle, and then being pumped by the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery, where it goes to the lungs. No gas exchange has happened yet, and now it is perfusing the pulmonary capillaries, and it is exchanging with alveoli. The relatively low concentration of oxygen in contact with this lowish concentration, this low partial pressure of oxygen is in contact with this partial pressure of oxygen. This partial pressure is higher than this partial pressure, so diffusion happens. This partial pressure of carbon dioxide is in contact with this partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and diffusion happens. And so the arterial blood, so you can see that arterial blood has equilibrated completely as far as CO2 is concerned, and has not quite equilibrated completely as far as oxygen is concerned. And now the blood, pulmonary veins, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta, brachial artery, femoral artery, whatever, into capillaries where it starts over again. Okay? So, what are some of the key numbers? I would like you to know that a normal P partial pressure of CO2 in both alveoli and in arterial blood, systemic arterial blood, is 40. 40 is a number to know. 40 millimeters of mercury is a value that is just so normal that, I mean, you can always look it up, but in a test setting, I might ask you a question, and I'm just going to assume you know it's 40. I am going to ask you to know that the partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood is 100 millimeters of mercury, and that's slightly lower than what's in the alveoli. You don't have to memorize 105 if you memorize 100, and you know that that's slightly lower than what's in the alveoli. So 40 and 100 are the only numbers that I want you to memorize here. It's not too bad. In medical school, they ask you to memorize all these numbers. So. Say what? I'm sorry? 40 millimeters of mercury is the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood and in alveolar gas. And 100 millimeters of mercury is the partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood, which is slightly lower than the partial pressure of oxygen in alveolar gas. That's both a concept and a memorization assignment. Okay, so let's do a clicker, and then let's do a few clickers maybe, and we'll see how long this takes, and then take a break. Again, the point of the clicker is not to evaluate your learning. Well, it's a little bit of that, but it's also to get a conversation going. And everybody should have a clicker, and if you don't, I've got some extras over here. So, no excuse for not showing me your clicker. So let me translate the question just a little bit, because it's using some abbreviations that I will use semi-consistently. Capital A refers to alveolar gas. So this is the partial pressure of CO2 in alveolar gas. And lowercase a, it's not my fault that alveoli and arteries start with the same letter. It's not, I didn't make it, but it's true. So lowercase a is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, PaCO2. This is the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood. And I will not ask you to memorize that. I will almost always translate it for you. But sometimes the equations don't have the translation, they just have the abbreviations. And understanding the equations is the main thing. Okay? So it will be helpful, although not required, for you to remember that capital A is alveolar gas and lowercase a is arterial blood. Okay, so what mechanisms permit the partial pressure of CO2 in alveolar gas to be equal to the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood? Which of these are true statements that permit that? The best answer, so you're all getting many of you are getting all of it, and some of you are getting some of it. They're all true. The surface area is very large, which allows for equilibration because of diffusion. The rate of blood flow through the pulmonary capillaries is very slow, so the blood has time to equilibrate. The rate of diffusion of carbon dioxide through the layers, right? So going back, I'm imaging that image of the of the alveoli that has the lipid molecules and then a water layer and then some other cellular layers. So CO2 is diffusing through surfactant layer and a water layer and membranes and extracellular layers, which are extremely thin, but the rate of diffusion is high. CO2 diffuses through all of those things very well. And the thickness, I've taught about these thicknesses are all extremely thin, so diffusion is high. So all of these mechanisms are important for allowing equilibration of CO2 between the alveoli and the arterial blood. They're all true. Any questions about that? The point is, again, to clarify for those of you who got some but not all of these right, to ask a question. Okay, well, let's do another one. Oh, I thought there was more. Okay. Well, then let's take a break now. Let's take a short break now, and I'll come back and I'll talk about one of the most important equations that we'll be using for the problem set.
Can you go back to the other side?
Yeah. Alveolar ventilation equation. So this is now the third equation of the day, and the first two were really easy and semi-intuitive. And this one is less easy and less intuitive, but it's not really hard. Well, let me wait till people come back. I jumped the gun.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
How do you pump reasons for O2 to also fully equilibrate?
They would hold for O2, except for this one. The rate of diffusion of oxygen is just a little bit lower, and that's the only thing that's different.
Okay.
This is the anatomy.
Right.
This is anatomy. This is anatomy.
Yeah.
This is chemistry.
Okay.
And that's what's different for oxygen.
Is it going like out there?
Well, oxygen is generally moving from the alveoli into the blood, and it's not fully equilibrating because the rate of diffusion, the diffusion constant for oxygen, is just a little bit lower than the diffusion constant of CO2. All of these things, the surfactant, the water, the membranes, they're all the same. It's the diffusion constant, that's why it's chemistry, that is different for oxygen than CO2. Okay, so here's the third equation of the day. This is not quite as intuitive as the first two that we talked about a few minutes ago, but it's not hard, but it's really important. So let's take our time and go through it. So this equation starts out simple. The partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood is equal to the partial pressure of CO2 in alveolar gas. We've already been using that because of all the factors in the previous clicker. Okay, so the first part of the equation is really easy. But the point is, if I give you the partial pressure of in alveoli, you already know the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood. And vice versa. If I give you a value for the partial pressure of CO2 in alveolar gas, you know the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood. Unless I've said we've got a disease state, in which case I would have to give you both, because they're not the same in some disease states. Okay, so the first part of this equation is trivial, but you can't ignore it in certain problem settings. Okay, now the second part of the equation, the partial pressure of CO2 in either arterial blood or alveolar gas is equal to a constant, and this number is not a number that you need to memorize. If in an exam setting I want you to use this equation, I will give you this number. But it is a number, and it's a true number, and this number comes from gas laws. And I don't want to derive it. It's not hard to derive, but I forgot how to do it. So, but it comes from PV equals nRT, which you learned about in chemistry. So it's a number. V dot. What is V dot? V dot represents so this is V dot CO2. This is the body's production of CO2. This is the rate at which the body produced. So V dots are rates. They're not volumes, they're rates. This is the rate of production of CO2 of the body. And at rest, so V dot CO2 is the metabolic rate of CO2 production. And sitting, resting, you produce about 200 milliliters, it's a volume term, 200 milliliters of CO2 at standard temperature and pressure, right? So that's why we have to think about standard temperature and pressure, but a gas is a volume, occupies a volume. So you produce about 200 milliliters of CO2 gas at standard temperature and pressure at rest. You're producing a little bit more than that now because hopefully you're thinking. You're not at rest, you're using your brains. And your brain does a lot of metabolism. So your body is producing slightly more than 200 milliliters per minute of CO2. My body is producing significantly more than 200. I'm not resting at all. If I were exercising, I would produce even more, right? So this is a typical value. You don't need to memorize it, but this is not a true value. This is a typical value under a certain circumstance, under a certain condition. So V dot CO2 is the body's production of CO2 in whatever condition the body is in. It's a rate, milliliters per minute. And you have to do it in milliliters per minute, not liters per minute, because if you do it in liters per minute, this number is off by a factor of 1,000. Okay, so this number, 863, only works if you do everything in milliliters. If you do things in liters, you have to use 0.863. The answers will be the same, but not if you use 863 and also use liters. Okay, so you just use milliliters, please. V dot A. What does big A stand for? Alveolar. So what do you suppose V dot, well, it says it right here. It's the ventilation. It's the rate of ventilation of the alveoli. And 4,200 milliliters per minute is a typical value. Remember, I'm going to scroll back through a bunch of slides. 4,200 was a typical value for alveolar ventilation. So we're just using a typical value again. But it's not a correct value because it depends on whether you're breathing hard or not. It depends on your breathing. So this value is typical. This value is typical. This value is one of the values that I want you to know because that's not just typical, but almost always accurate. So let's look at this equation. There is a linear relationship between the production of CO2 and the partial pressure of CO2 in blood. It's a straight line. There is an inverse or reciprocal relationship between the ventilation of the alveoli and the partial pressure of CO2 in blood. Those are key. Understanding that there's a linear proportionality between production of CO2 and partial pressure of CO2. And there's a reciprocal relationship between ventilation of alveoli and partial pressure of CO2. That's key. And simply knowing this equation is helpful. Don't memorize the 863. Do memorize that if you put partial pressure on the left side of the equation, you've got to put V dot CO2 in the numerator, and you've got to put ventilation in the denominator. If you get those flipped upside down, you're all wrong. Yeah?
I understand the linear relationship, but I don't quite understand the reciprocal relationship between the ventilation rate and partial pressure.
You mean why physiologically or why mathematically?
No, physiologically.
Oh, okay. Mathematically, it makes sense. Okay, good. So physiologically, so this is a useful question. If I hyperventilate, if I ventilate more than I need to maintain the partial pressure of CO2 in blood. So this is actually really important. So what we do is we ventilate our alveoli so that the partial pressure of CO2 in blood is 40. We have respiratory control. So if I artificially hyperventilate, I can do that, right? I've got control over my ventilation. I can go, I could do that quite a lot. I am hyperventilating. I am increasing alveolar ventilation by breathing 24 times a minute instead of 12 times a minute. Even if and I'm hyperventilating because my tidal volume is bigger than 500 if I work at it. If I increase ventilation, I am exhaling, I am excreting more CO2 than I need to, and the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood goes down. This is what hyperventilation is what respiratory physiologists call blowing off CO2. By hyperventilating, you are excreting more CO2 than you need to, and the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood goes down. That's assuming that you're not producing more CO2 than you are. So at rest, so let's pretend I'm at rest, and I hyperventilate, I'm blowing off CO2. If, on the other hand, I'm running up and down the hall, and I'm running up and down the hall, producing more CO2, and ventilating my alveoli a lot, in order to maintain a partial pressure of CO2 at 40, I would not call that hyperventilation. Hyperventilation is when you ventilate more than you need to maintain a partial pressure of CO2 at 40 millimeters of mercury. If I exercise and start producing a bunch of CO2, and I don't ventilate more, if I exercise and produce a bunch of CO2 and I don't increase my ventilation, what's going to happen to the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood? Is it going to stay the same? Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? It's going to go up if I increase, just mathematically, but also makes sense physiologically. If I produce a lot of CO2 and I don't ventilate it off, it's going to build up somewhere, and it builds up in the blood. We don't have a place where we store CO2 except the blood. So this ratio, the production of CO2 and the ventilation of CO2, well, the production of CO2 and the ventilation of alveoli is maintained at a balance in order to maintain the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood. And we'll see in a few minutes why that, not just, well, that comes down to acid-base chemistry as well. So if I hyperventilate, I am ventilating more than my body needs. If I exercise and I don't ventilate more, what would we call that if you were a scientist and you know that hyperventilation is breathing more than you need? Hypoventilation. If I exercise and I don't ventilate more, that's hypoventilation. And we'll talk, by the end of this section of the class, we'll talk about how the body controls ventilation. There are chemoreceptors in our brain that tell the respiratory system, hey, you need to breathe more. Or, hey, you need to stop breathing. You need to stop breathing as much. So when you exercise, do you breathe faster and harder? Of course you do. You're all aware of it. That's not hyperventilation. That's just normal ventilation for your body's condition of producing that much more CO2. When you start exercising, do you start thinking, I need to start breathing faster because I'm about to exercise? Do you do that? No, of course you don't. You just you automatically start breathing faster and deeper when you start exercising because there is automatic parts of your brain that are sensing, ooh, CO2 is going up. I better start ventilating some more. Or at the end of an exercise, oh, CO2 is actually going down. I need to ventilate less. Okay? So there's this linear relationship between carbon dioxide and partial pressure of CO2. There isn't a linear relationship between partial pressure of oxygen and ventilation. So we don't see the same equation for oxygen. Yes, me.
Just a concept confusion. By ventilation, do you mean it's like the movement of the air into the alveoli, but do you also include like the movement of the air from the alveoli?
Yes, ventilation includes both movement of gas into the alveoli and movement of gas out of the alveoli. Both of those are components of ventilation. We can't have one without the other because if we move gas into the alveoli and we don't move gas out, we're blowing up. And if we move gas out of the alveoli and we don't move gas in, we're collapsing. And that's not what we're doing. We're ventilating by pumping air into and out of alveoli. Both of those are part of ventilation. Just like pumping, there's a fan that's blowing air into this room, and that air is then being drawn off of the room. The pressure in this air, the volume of air in this room is kept constant because we have input of air and export of air. That's ventilation. Okay, so here are some of the more clickers. Let's do some clickers to try to use the concepts that I've been talking about. And again, the main point here is to answer questions that these questions provoke. So what happens to the partial pressure of CO2? I'm going to translate. What happens to the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood? Oh, there it is. What happens to the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood if you hyperventilate? Right, it decreases. You're blowing off CO2. Hyperventilation is blowing off CO2. What happens to partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood if you exercise but don't change your ventilation? I kind of forgot that I had the same things that I was teaching about a minute ago as clickers. Right, it goes up. Okay, what happens to the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood if you exercise but change your ventilation to compensate? I would accept both A and B, right? There is a slight increase, which is what tells your brain to ventilate some more. But mostly it's trying to stay the same. So both of those are correct. If you are exercising and breathing quickly and deeply, that is to say breathing with a high respiratory frequency, that's what quickly means, and deeply, that's with a large tidal volume, so that changes in the arterial partial, so here you can see I didn't translate it, so this is where a context where you would have to remember the translation yourself. The partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood, so the changes are small, is that called hyperventilation. You're breathing fast and deep, but the changes in P arterial or CO2 are small. Do we call that hyperventilation? Two correct answers. Okay? The answer that I hope you will use is no. You will find in some physiology books people writing hyperventilation when they're in an exercise setting. They will call that hyperventilation, and it's just not right from a physiological perspective. If I exercise and I breathe fast and deep, I'm not hyperventilating. I'm just ventilating what I need to ventilate. But there are books, you'll see it. If you read anything, read respiratory physiology, you'll see them calling that hyperventilation in a sort of less formal sense. So there are people who say, well, normal tidal volume is 500. Anything larger than that is leading to hyperventilation. Or the respiratory frequency is 12. Anything larger than 18 is hyperventilation. Well, that's only in a resting setting. If you're exercising and you're not breathing at 24 breaths per minute, or maybe even more, you're hypoventilating. You see that it's a subtle point, and I won't test you on it, but I might quiz you on it. Okay, so by quiz I just mean use it in conversation. I won't put it on a quiz. I want us to use the language of hyperventilation, normal ventilation, and hypoventilation. I want to use it from the correct physiological perspective. Okay, so now we're going to start to talk about acids and bases. You've had this in chemistry, I'm assuming. How many of you have taken Gen Chem? Did you have acid and base chemistry in Gen Chem? Yeah, okay, so everybody has had it. Whether you took organic or not, everybody has had it. You don't have to have Econal or Biochem to have the basics here. So those of you who are taking, how many of you are in Biochem or have taken Biochem? And have you done gas law, gas exchange in Biochem? Okay, so you have an advantage over the people who haven't taken Biochem, but not a big advantage, at least as far as I'm concerned. So you understand acid-base chemistry. So the acid that we're talking about in this case is carbonic acid. So when carbon dioxide mixes with water, it forms carbonic acid. And it does this, if I take a beaker of water and I put it in an atmosphere of carbon dioxide, we don't have a high concentration of carbon dioxide, but a tiny amount of that carbon dioxide dissolves in the water, associates with water, and forms carbonic acid. Our bodies do the same thing, and it's accelerated by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. We're going to see this enzyme there's a high concentration in red blood cells and in other cells in the body. So there's plenty of carbonic anhydrase to accelerate this equilibrium. But remember, this is an equilibrium. The enzyme doesn't push it one way or the other. The enzyme simply accelerates this equilibrium. Accelerates this rate. Carbonic acid dissociates into protons, hydronium ion, isn't that what you call it? And bicarbonate ion. Okay? So if we let's just use this equation. This is an equilibrium that I do want you to know. It's not exactly an equation, but it's an equilibrium condition. So if I increase the partial pressure of CO2 by not breathing enough for whatever condition I'm doing, if I increase the partial pressure of CO2, I shift this equilibrium to the right I produce more acid, I produce more proton, and the pH goes down. More acid is a low pH. I am asking you to remember from Gen Chem that more acid is a low pH. You know that. And if I hyperventilate, that is to say if I decrease the partial pressure of CO2, then I draw this equilibrium to the left and I consume some protons, and the concentration of protons goes down and the pH goes up. Okay, so hypoventilation is associated with a acid pH, and hyperventilation is associated with a alkaline pH in our body. And pH control is essential because the enzymes that we depend on to live have a pH optimum. They evolved in a setting where the pH was 7.4. And if our pH goes even 0.2 units away from 7.4, 7.2 to 7.6, if we go outside of that range, those enzymes start to fail, and our whole bodies, our brain, our kidneys, our muscles stop working well. And so our body has evolved very highly controlled mechanisms to keep the pH at around 7.4. And we keep the pH at 7.4 by controlling the amount of CO2 in the blood. And this is why we evolved a mechanism. Sorry, I'm going to go all the way back. This is why we evolved a mechanism to keep arterial blood not what's in the air, but at 40 millimeters of mercury. CO2 is our pH buffer. CO2 and bicarbonate. So those of you who have learned some details of buffering systems, we have a CO2 bicarbonate buffering system in order to keep our pH at 7.4 so that all the enzymes that our body depends on for metabolism and for nervous activity and for muscle activity, et cetera, those enzymes work well. That's why we keep the partial pressure of CO2 not very low, because we need this buffer. Okay, so let's go to this, the equilibration. Well, so let's not look, if something were to happen to increase the bicarbonate concentration, let's just play with that. If our body somehow increased bicarbonate, that would shift this equilibrium to the left. That would consume protons. That would be an increase in pH. So I do want you to be able to manipulate this equilibrium and tell me what manipulations would do to pH. We control the carbon dioxide part of our acid-base buffer by breathing. We control the bicarbonate concentration in our blood, which is the other part of the buffering system, with our kidneys. And so we'll talk about bicarbonate control when we get to the renal system, which is the next system. So just like the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system are linked, the respiratory system and the renal systems are linked. And you can imagine some final exam questions where I might ask you to combine that knowledge. Okay, so the last point for today is the well-loved Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. How many of you have had the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation in any chemistry setting at all? Okay, almost all of you have had that. So here is the general form of an acid. The acid we're talking about here is carbonic acid, which came from the combination of CO2 and water. So, but here's the general equation for an acid-base interaction. And here's the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, which I don't want to teach you because you have fallen in love with it on your own. So here's the general form of the Henderson-Hasselbalch. Isn't that how you say Henderson-Hasselbalch equation? Here is the acid-base equilibrium that we are working with. Here is the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation for CO2. What's this S? This is turning partial pressure of CO2 into concentration of CO2 by including the solubility of CO2. Partial pressure times solubility gives you concentration. You don't need to know that. In fact, you don't need to know this equation, because what we are going to do is we're going to use a graphic formulation of this equation called the called Henderson-Hasselbalch, called the Davenport diagram. If I had blanked on that, I would have given myself an F for the whole day. The Davenport diagram is a graphic way of displaying the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. So we're going to start there on Thursday with the Davenport diagram. But I want you to remember that when we get to the Davenport diagram, it's nothing more than a graphical way of presenting respiratory physiology and the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation together. Okay? So that's it for today. You can start to work on the problem set. It's due on Monday at 11:30 p.m. There are going to be questions that you can't work with yet because I haven't taught it. You just wait till Thursday for those. Okay, see you Thursday.